Thanks for joining us as we take a look at the Great Depression. And in Chapter 26, Part 1 here, we'll take a look at the causes that led to the Great Depression. Now, many people kind of associate the beginning of the Great Depression with the stock market crash of 1929. Now, this is true that kind of signified that troubling times had hit us, but it's not like it was the main cause. There are many signs showing that the economy is already weakening. Yeah, true, there was speculation in the stock market that had, kind of drove the prices of these companies well above what they should have been. And people were, spending money that they didn't have by buying on margin, which means that they were kind of borrowing money in order to invest in the stock market, which drove the prices up further. But as these loans are called in and the stocks drop, we realize that a great catastrophe is amongst us. There were other things that led, though, to the Great Depression. For one thing, you can see in the 20s, income was unevenly distributed. You had the few that made a lot of the money, and then you can see the bottom 90% made roughly probably 18% of the national income. And so you've got a lot of people that were living at or below the poverty level and maybe didn't have enough money to try to purchase these consumer products that were being created. And when people aren't buying consumer goods, then what we see is that industries, warehouses fill up. And as they accumulate more product, they're going to cut back on production, which eventually leads to more workers having to be laid off. And another thing that kind of affected the number of workers a company would need was the fact that our industries were becoming more mechanized. Machines were doing more and more work, which means we needed less and less laborers. Well, as we could produce more goods with less workers, they lay the workers off. And once again, what we see then is that they would lack purchasing power and wouldn't be able to buy the cars or the radios or whatever product it is that they wanted. Therefore, leading to, once again, an increase in inventories in those industries. And therefore, the next step would be laying off more workers. And this kind of cycle of depression just kind of kept on happening as more and more workers were laid off for various reasons. But not only were people, borrowing money to speculate in the stock market, they were also borrowing money to try to, buy those products that they couldn't afford. And as you can see from the chart here, the amount of U.S. debt increases dramatically throughout the 1920s. And the more that people borrowed, eventually they can't keep borrowing more, and sometimes they can't even pay back what they did borrow, and that would hurt banks, and that would make obviously have further effects that if they couldn't pay off what they had already borrowed, they can't keep spending money and buying these consumer products. And so once again, it kind of leads to these growing warehouses becoming more full, and companies once again having to cut back production as people couldn't keep buying all these goods that were being produced. But suffice it to say, little over 6 months after Hoover takes office in March of 1929, we do see that the Great Depression has struck. And the people are going to place the blame on Herbert Hoover. In fact, we get nicknames like Hoovervilles. It's like these shanty towns that you see here that people lived, which actually quite remarkably even like set up like city boards and councils to try to keep these shanty towns in order and clean and kind of with law-abiding citizens. But we also have like Hoover flags and Hoover blankets, which were like people walking around with their pockets turned inside out or maybe covering up on park benches with just a newspaper. And Hoover's name becomes synonymous with the troubled economic times. Now, early on, we kind of see that Hoover is he's kind of too slow and cautious when it comes to trying to fix the problems, as he believed that unemployment relief was most beneficial if it came from private charities rather than direct government handouts. And so therefore, we see a continuing rise in unemployment. And really, this Great Depression will affect all levels of society, but the middle class will be hit the hardest. As you see, kind of the wealthy many times are able to kind of maybe not live such opulent lives, but at least they had enough saved up. And the poor were already kind of used to living in rough conditions. And so this middle class will be struck especially hard. Now, again, Hoover does try some things to help, but it's really looked at as being too little and too late. But as the Depression worsens, we see that Hoover is also not flexible enough in dealing with the issues through kind of an example of what becomes known as the bonus army. These were veterans of World War I who had converged on Washington, D.C. to try to ask for their bonus or money payments that were promised them to be paid sooner because they needed the money. But what we see is that Hoover sends in the army under the command of General Douglas MacArthur to clear out the bonus marchers. And they go in there with tear gas and fixed bayonets and kind of try to, scare off the marchers and get them to go home. And being that this happened in 1932, an election year, it really took a toll on Hoover's image and the way that he was dealing with the Great Depression. And as the Depression worsened, the effects are felt by many. For the women, a lot of times they're paid less already, but even more so during the Great Depression. We also see during this time that married women were oftentimes fired because they were seen as taking jobs away from who should be the wage earners, the men. And so therefore, women who were married or got married were oftentimes ended up being fired. And for the children, because food was so hard to come by, they suffered from malnutrition, which was one of the biggest problems that they had to deal with. Not only that, but schools had to close or at least shorten their school years because they couldn't afford to maybe heat their buildings or pay their teachers or provide lunches or meals or whatever it might be. And so not only can these children not eat, but they lack getting the education that they might have been used to during this time. Then for the minorities, as many African Americans had kind of moved north looking for jobs during World War I, what they encountered during this time was that they were probably the first ones fired. And unemployment actually for urban African American population was over 50% at a time when the overall unemployment rate was around 25, upwards of 30% overall for the entire nation. So African Americans were a lot of times the last hired and therefore the first fired. But now turning our attention to the farmers during this era, they kind of dealt with other issues as well. Not only had they kind of overproduced, for like World War I, they increased their production. But what happens after the war then is that because that increased production, we see the prices they get for their goods falls dramatically. And so this overproduction and falling prices really takes its toll on the farmers. But what hurts even more is the fact that throughout the 1930s, our nation goes through probably one of the worst droughts in the nation's history in what becomes known as the Dust Bowl. And you can see that the Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas region was kind of like the hardest hit. But this severe drought led to even worsening conditions for the farmers, as we see what becomes known as dust storms. Dust that would be whipped up on the prairie and reach thousands of feet in the sky, and it could eventually blanket a whole town, and it turn like a high noon into what would look like midnight because it would block out the sun. And it was so dry that many parts of Oklahoma and Kansas, sometimes we see upwards of 98% of the population fleeing the area because it was just too tough to continue on being a farmer and being successful. And those farmers who ended up leaving west many times for like California became known as the Okies because a lot of times they were fleeing from Oklahoma. and they're heading west to hopefully greener lands to try to start a new life. So we kind of see an exodus then out of this kind of Midwestern region. But regardless of who you were or where you lived, the Depression affected everyone. And yeah, Hoover did try to provide some support in the kind of like building projects like Boulder Dam, which eventually becomes known as Hoover Dam, or trying to provide assistance in what becomes known as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which gave billions of dollars in loans to financial institutions and other industries to try to keep them from closing. But in all reality, it was too little too late. As Hoover kind of took the approach of what was known as rugged individualism, where people try to pick themselves up or look to local charities and assistance programs because he didn't want people becoming dependent on like direct federal aid or federal handouts. And so he was more cautious and restrained in how he tried to tackle the issues of the Great Depression. Something that's going to be very different compared to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who we'll take a look at in our next episode.